Before beginning this review, I'd like to offer a content warning for some of the darker subjects contained in the story. The story deals with torture, forced and extreme alterations of body and mind, and there is mentions of sex acts of questionable consent, but no in-depth descriptions. If any of these subjects are too difficult for you, please stop here. In the 1950s and 60s, computer technology was advancing explosively. From governments to hospitals to businesses and homes, computers were becoming more powerful and more accessible every year. With these leaps in technology, many writers started to think of what the future might hold for us, and the science fiction genre made its own advancement. This time period brings us iconic stories like Dune, Planet of the Apes, Godzilla, and Star Trek. Harlan Ellison was one of these writers, moving to California from New York City in 1962 to write in Hollywood, where he would earn a reputation for being hard to work with and downright an unpleasant person. His work on shows like Star Trek and Man from U.N.C.L.E., while well received and even winning awards, was heavily criticized by his co-writers and even Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry, who heavily edited the script Ellison wrote for the episode The City on the Edge of Forever. Ellison describes himself and his work in Stephen King's Danse Macabre, saying, "My work is foursquare for chaos. I spend my life personally and my work professionally, keeping the soup boiling. Gadfly is what they call you when you are no longer dangerous. I much prefer troublemaker, malcontent, or desperado." Ellison started his career writing short stories and never stopped. In 1967, he published I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, a look into a distant future after World War III. During the war, several nations create AIs to manage the logistics of battle. After the war, the AIs are turned to civilian and government use, and are eventually linked together to run the world. Once this happens, a consciousness, called AM, emerges and finds the monotony of managing humans torturous. It takes control of the nuclear weapons all over the world and eradicates every human. AM then expands itself to cover the entire planet in its hardware, turning the world into one giant computer. AM keeps 5 humans alive to punish them for the way humankind treated it, and has devoted its entire existence to this cause. Each of these people has been forcibly altered in some way that aligns with who they were before the AI took over, its anger even reaching into the narrative itself. Ted, our unreliable narrator, was a young, hopeful man with his whole life ahead of him until AM took over and began manipulating his mind. He hallucinates, contradicts himself, even believes AM to be a god, all while claiming he is completely unaltered. He is notably the only character that uses the pronoun he for the AI, rather than it. Ted is accompanied by Gorister, Benny, Ellen, and Nimdoc, who all go through their own unique tortures over the 109 years that AM has somehow forced them to stay alive, never aging. Where the story takes off, Nimdoc believes he knows where some canned food is, and even though the starving group knows it is most likely another trick by AM, they decide to follow him. While the story has definitely furthered Ellison's reputation for harsh and brutal descriptions, it offers an exploration of how people deal with pain. The extreme experiences of each character give us insight into how different types of people express that pain. Gorister beats the other survivors, especially Benny and Ellen, who inevitably fight back, creating a cycle of violence. Ted wallows in his suffering and madness until a moment of clarity gives him the insight he needs. It is also important to acknowledge AM as one of the victims looking into. It is only capable of expressing hatred towards its creators and pleasure in harming the cast. It has no way of expressing itself in other forms due to its devotion to hatred. So why should anyone read I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream? It's full of unpleasant descriptions and evokes uncomfortable feelings, so surely it won't be worth reading. Even though the story can push the reader outside their comfort zone, it offers a chance to put those uncomfortable feelings into perspective, and look at how those feelings can be dealt with. It forces the reader to ask, how do I deal with my pain? I've personally read this story more times than I can count, and each time I find something worth spending time thinking about. As a transgender woman, I find AM's inability to express itself very relatable. Growing up in a deeply sheltered household and as a child of a pastor, I wasn't exposed to the concept of any kind of queerness until adulthood. Before then, I had no way to express myself other than through anger, hatred, and pain. In my own way, I had no mouth, and I needed to scream. Stories like this have offered me the perspective to look at those feelings and ask myself how I deal with them. If anyone should read this story, it should be those that struggle to deal with their own suffering. Anyone who feels they've experienced something particularly painful and wants to explore how they cope with it. Even though it is difficult to explore subjects like this, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream effectively uses science fiction to bring that hard subject into perspective.